Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I wanted to show off my new drum sander that I've been working on. I actually finished building this about a month ago, and I've had a chance to run it through its paces, and it works fantastic. So I wanted to give you a quick tour of the machine and show you some of the features and give you kind of an idea of how I built it. And the reason for that is because I am in the process of developing sets of plans for a lot of the tools that I use, and that'll include this drum sander as well as my buffing machine, my mobile workbench, and my CNC machine. Now, I've been talking about all this for quite a while. As it turns out, drawing up these plans and instructions has been a massive undertaking, far more than I ever thought it would be. However, they're getting really close to being finished, and once they're done, what I plan to do is I'm going to create a page on my eguitarplans.com website. And that's the website where I sell plans for building your own guitars. And I'm going to create a section where you can purchase plans for these machines and the workbench and so on. So, and there may be some additional things that I'll add to it in the future, but for now, I'll include those plans, and they'll be available at a reasonable price. It's not going to be very expensive, and what you'll get is a PDF file that'll contain the instructions for how to assemble it, as well as a parts and hardware list and a cut sheet for all the different pieces that go into building them. So, but for this episode, I wanted to kind of show you my thoughts and what went into building this machine, and I'll even show you the machine in action. Okay, so first of all, you'll notice that the whole machine was assembled using 2x6 lumber, and specifically I think I purchased 3 or 4 lengths of 10-foot 2x6 Douglas fir from my local lumber yard, and that kind of wood works great for this sort of structure. It's extremely inexpensive and easy to work with. So to assemble the whole thing, it's held together using 2.5-inch long number 8 construction screws and tight bond wood glue. Now, of course, you could also use nuts and bolts to assemble this if you wanted to have the option of being able to disassemble the machine, for example, if you were going to move it to a different location. However, the structure of this thing goes together so quickly and is so cheap to build. Really, if I was going to move this machine, all I'd do is I'd save the hardware for it and build a new structure wherever it was I needed to build it. I also used a 4x8 foot sheet of 3/4 inch thick interior grade plywood, and then I picked up I think it was a 2x4 foot sheet of 3/4 inch thick MDF. And that's really all there was to it as far as the wood in this structure. And the rest of the hardware that is used in this machine is stuff you can just pick up at your local hardware store. And I think ultimately what this machine cost to build, not including the motor, was about maybe $75 to $100, maybe a little bit more, but that's about what the cost was. And the motor, interestingly enough, is also the same motor that I use on my buffing machine. And what I have done is I've come up with a way to move the motor quickly from my buffer over to my drum sander and back and forth. Because in my shop, I'm not using both machines at the same time. Since I'm the sole employee of Highline Guitars, I'm either going to be using the drum sander or I'll be using the buffer, but never at the same time. So I can easily move the motor back and forth. And it just simply is a matter of unplugging it, loosening the nuts on 2 bolts, and then moving it over to the other machine, plugging it in, and bolting it up. So it's a very simple and affordable way to have multiple machines, but only one motor. So I thought that was a pretty clever idea. Also, you'll notice the machine is mobile. I can roll it around my shop. And the way I'm doing it is I have 4 casters, and on each side there is a board. It's a 2x6 board, and the casters are attached to that board with hinges. And then I have this simple lever here which it's a locking lever that locks it in the down position so I can roll it around. And then when I move the drum sander to where I want to use it, it's just a simple matter of lifting up that lever, and that lowers the whole drum sander down to the floor. And I do that on both sides. And then once I'm done, if I need to roll the machine out of the way, all I have to do is just lift it up and it's good to go. It's a simple way to do it, and yet it is a better way than using locking or braking casters, because even with braking casters, the contact patch between the bottom of the caster wheel and the floor is so small that stability can become an issue. Okay, the business end of the drum sander is obviously the drum, which is underneath this plywood drum and belt cover. And if I remove that, you can see the drum. The drum is made of 3/4 inch thick MDF discs that are 5 inches in diameter. And there are 24 discs on here, which makes a drum that's 18 inches wide. And then on each end, the last disc on each end it features this sort of wedge-shaped cutout, which is held in with a grab screw that threads into an insert that's inserted into the wood down here. And that allows me to capture and hold the end of my sandpaper. And the sandpaper that I'm using on here is a cheap roll of 2 3/4 inch wide 80 grit sandpaper that I picked up from Harbor Freight. And they sell this same kind of sandpaper in, I believe it's 80, maybe 150. I can't remember the exact grit sizes. I'll run that across the bottom here, or the top. And I use pretty much just 80 grit. But the drum itself is attached to a 1-inch diameter turned and ground and polished steel shaft that runs through a pair of pillow blocks. And the shaft is exactly 24 inches wide. And that gives me enough space to extend the shaft out from the bearing so I can attach a pulley on this end, and then enough to run through the bearing on this side, and still have enough to attach my disc sanding components. So the way that this drum is secured to the shaft is when I glued up the discs, I glued the discs together in 2 9-inch halves, which were separate. And then in roughly the center of the shaft, I drilled a 3/16 inch of diameter hole through the shaft so that I could install a 3/16 inch diameter steel pin. And then I slid 1/2 of my drum onto it. And in the end of that half, I had a slot routed into the end disc to correspond with that pin. And it just slid over the pin. Then I slid the other drum on and then glued them together at the center, and that's how it's secured on there. So it's a pretty simple method of attaching the drums to the shaft. And I then attached a couple of small blocks here. There's 4 of them total, and that's what allows me to position my cover when I put it on. And on this end, you can see I have a belt-driven pulley that runs down to my motor down here. And this is a Smith Jones general purpose 1 horsepower, 1800 RPM electric motor. And it is attached to a 3/4 inch thick plywood board here. And this board is then attached to the frame with a couple of hinges. And what that allows is it allows me to, I can raise and lower the motor because it's on the hinge. And the weight of the motor itself is what pulls the tension tight on the belt. And to keep this whole thing from vibrating, which is common with this type of belt, I have just a simple block of wood here that's attached with a hinge to the structure. And then it just simply pops down in place, and that keeps it from vibrating. However, on the plans that I'm developing for this machine, I've come up with a mount for the motor that is easily removable and can be removed from this machine and then transferred over to the buffing machine if you so desire. And what I recommend is, instead of using one of these regular, this is a 4L V belt, is to use a link belt, because link belts dramatically reduce the vibration to the point where this sort of mechanism may not be necessary. But it works well for this situation, and I get absolutely no vibration whatsoever. Now, the motor itself is spinning clockwise, so it goes in this direction. You know, when I was doing research on building a drum sander, I looked at a lot of videos on people's homemade drum sanding machines, and none of them ever talked about what direction the drum is spinning. And in truth, it really doesn't matter. I found in testing this machine, this motor is reversible. I tried both directions, and it doesn't really matter that much, but I would rather it spin in this direction. This is the feed direction. So if it's running against the direction of the feed, I think you get a more efficient sanding. And I know what some of you might be thinking. Isn't it possible that a machine like this, the drum, the sandpaper on the drum could catch on the wood and then fling your piece of wood? That never seems to happen. I haven't had that kind of an issue at all, ever, with any of my drum sanders. So I don't really think it's something to be concerned about. It seems like it would be, but unless you're trying to take off way too much wood in a single pass, which this machine is not designed to do, you should never have a problem with it throwing a piece of wood across the room. And obviously, for that reason, just for safety purposes, you never want to be standing directly in front of or behind. You always want to be standing off to the side when you're using the machine. It's just common sense. One thing I want to mention now, because I know if I don't, I'm going to get a lot of comments about it, is some of you are probably wondering why I didn't include a belt feed on this drum sander. Because after all, if you look at a lot of the commercially made drum sanders out there, like Jet and the Grizzly drum sanders, they all have a belt feed. And the simple answer is it just isn't necessary, especially for the type of work that I do. Now, the purpose of a belt feed is to ensure that when you feed the material into the machine, it is fed through at a consistent speed. Because when you're feeding material into a drum sander, if you hesitate or there's any variation in the speed that you're feeding the material in, you can get what is known as scalloping across the surface that you're sanding. And that scalloping will conform to the shape of the drum where it's touching the wood. So to avoid that, a belt feed is a great solution to maintain consistency when feeding it through. However, you'll notice when you look at a lot of homemade do-it-yourself drum sanders, all they use is just a simple table to slide the material through. And based on the experiences I've had with my two previous drum sanders, I know that I can feed wood through a drum sander at a consistent speed and not have to worry about the scalloping that can occur. And another advantage to having a belt feed is that it really is a good idea if you're going to be sanding wood that is longer than, say, 4 feet. And especially if you're going to be doing a lot of wood that's over 4 feet, because feeding long boards through can be a bit of a challenge. Well, I'm not going to be ever feeding anything longer than, say, one of my neck blanks, which are typically around 30 inches or less in length. So I don't really have to worry about the length of the board being an issue. The other problem that there is with belt feed tables is the amount of complexity and the cost that they add to a build. A belt feed, first of all, is going to require that you source a belt, or at least try to make one, and I'm not even sure what would go into making a belt. But I do know that pre-made belts that are used on other drum sanders, replacement belts, are really expensive. The other thing you have to consider is the mechanics behind it. You need to have a drive roller and then a guide roller. And you need to have the ability to adjust the tracking of the belt while it's in operation so that you can keep the belt centered while it's working. The mechanics of that structure, while not extremely complicated, simply adds a little bit of complexity to your build, and that means more cost. The other thing you have to consider is that the motor which drives the belt has to be a gear motor that runs at the correct RPM, and it also has to be powerful enough to be able to feed the wood so that it won't bog down as it enters the drum, between the drum and the belt itself. So all of that together, combined with the fact that I know I can feed the wood through manually, sort of ruled out using a belt feed on this design. Of course, that doesn't mean you couldn't add one yourself, but just bear in mind that it's going to greatly increase the cost and the complexity of the build. Regardless of whether you're going to use a belt feed or a sliding table like I am using, you have to have a way to raise and lower that table in order to accommodate different thicknesses of wood that you're going to run through the drum sander. And the way I've done it is the table is attached on this end with a pair of no-play hinges. And those hinges allow me to raise this end of the table, thereby decreasing the amount of space. And of course, as I lower it, that increases the amount of clearance. And when this table is lowered all the way down, I can accommodate wood up to 3 inches thick. And then when I bring the table up, I can go down as low as I can safely run through here before the drum starts to touch the surface of the table itself. So basically from 0 up to 3 inches. When I did my research trying to decide what kind of mechanism I would use for raising and lowering this end of the table, I found that there's a lot of different solutions that people have come up with. They involve cams, sliding blocks, and the most common that I found people were using was to run a threaded rod up through this front board, usually through a threaded insert, so that the tip of the rod comes into contact with the bottom of the table. And as you turn that rod and feed it up through that threaded insert, it pushes up against the back of the table and raises this end of it. And that seems to be a pretty simple and obvious solution, but I found with my 2 previous drum sanders that I built, which used that approach, the problem is because the contact patch between that threaded rod and the bottom of this table is so tiny, you have very little support, especially towards the outer edges for the table. As a result, no matter how thick you make the table, and whether or not you use a no-play hinge or rack your hinges to reduce play, you'll still end up with flex on either side because there's such a tiny amount of support at the center of the table along that bottom edge. Another disadvantage with using a threaded rod that runs up through this front board is that you have to have some way to either lock that threaded rod into position, or you need to have some kind of robust spring-loaded anti-backlash approach, because the machine's vibration will cause that rod to slowly turn on its own, which will cause the table to lower away from the drum as you're using it. And that's going to mess up the accuracy of your sanding. Okay, so what I have here is I've got a 2x4, which has a hole drilled across its length, and then a threaded T-nut, which is installed in the front. Then I have a long threaded rod, which was installed horizontally, that comes out the front and is attached to this handle. On the other side of the threaded rod, I have a washer and a nylon lock nut, which holds it into position here. And on the front of the handle, I have another nylon lock nut with a washer. And then I have a nylon lock nut on this side with a washer against the face. And then on the back side of this board, I have 2 jam nuts and a washer. And what this does is it allows me to adjust the tension, by tightening the screws or the nuts on the back. That allows me to adjust the tension so that when the machine is running, vibration won't cause the machine or cause the handle and the screw to turn. It stays stationary in position. And then, like I said, I have a jam nut to keep that locked into position. So it's basically adjust it once and you're good to go type of thing. But the way this works is as I turn the handle, the screw pulls this board either toward me or away, depending on the direction that I'm turning the handle. And then this board, which is attached to the 2x4 with a pair of hinges, is also attached on this end with a pair of hinges to the back of the top of the table. And so if I turn the handle counterclockwise, I'm moving the 2x4 back, and that decreases the angle of this board, which then lowers the whole top or the whole sliding table. And as you can see, it's a very smooth action. So I can be very precise in how I adjust the clearance between the table and the drum. And that allows me to precisely control how much of the material I'm sanding off the wood. So it works quite well, and it stays in position as I use the machine, so that's not a problem. To maximize the usefulness of this machine, I also decided to incorporate a disc sanding feature on this end. And the way I did that was I cut a disc that's 10 inches in diameter, and then I cut 2 more smaller discs with a hole drilled in the center that mounts onto the shaft that the drum is attached to. And I cut a slot here and then added a screw with a nut, and that's how I clamp the disc to the shaft. And on this side, I added a table which is attached to the structure of the drum sander using a pair of hinges. And then on either end, I added a pair of knobs. And what I can do is I can loosen these knobs, and the table can go from flat to a 45-degree angle and anywhere in between. And then all I have to do is tighten the knobs. So that's a really cool way to increase the capabilities of a simple drum sander to also include a disc sander. Now, one of the problems with drum sanders is that they produce an enormous amount of sanding dust, which of course is harmful to breathe. So what I've done is I've added a connector on top here. This is just a 2.5-inch flanged inlet fitting, and I can attach my dust collector hose to that fitting to suck away all the dust as I'm using the drum sander. And of course, this hose actually goes down the other side, so it doesn't get in the way. And then for the disc sander, I have this old, it's a dust collecting shroud that I had picked up at my local woodworking supply. And what I can do with this is attach a hose to the bottom, and that catches a good majority of the dust that's produced by this disc. Because if I'm sanding on this section, which is where I normally sand, because the wheel's turning in this direction, it's throwing the dust straight down into this dust collecting shroud. So it does a pretty good job. And overall, this whole approach seems to do a pretty good job of keeping dust out of the air. Okay, there is one other thing I need to mention, because if I don't, the know-it-all certainly will, and that is, before I put the sandpaper on either the drum or the disc, I made sure that both were Trude. And to do that with the drum, I took an 18-inch wide piece of plywood and attached some 60 grit sandpaper to it, and then I set it onto the table. And while running the motor, I raised the table until the drum came into contact with that sandpaper. And I just let it sit there for a couple minutes and then slowly raised the table until the drum was completely Trude. Then on the disc itself, I used a dial indicator to check runout, and then a block of wood with sandpaper on it, 60 grit sandpaper, and just ran that up against the face until I had the front face of the disc completely trued. And it was trued down to easily about a thousandth of an inch accuracy. I didn't worry about the outer perimeter, don't really care about that. And I still may at some point add some kind of a shroud just for safety purposes. I say that, but I don't know if I actually ever will. I should though. All right, guys, well, there you have it. The Highline Guitars drum sanding slash disc sanding machine. It's a simple, inexpensive way to incorporate an incredibly valuable piece of equipment in your luthier guitar building workshop. So until the next episode, take care, and I will see you soon.